I can't help but think about how the governing philosophies of those who run our institutions have changed over time. So we've talked a lot about freedom, compassion, equality today, and that they're the things that guide, don't divide us. And in my mind, it strikes me as, well, these are the qualities, the values that over time have been created, at least socially, by institutional Christianity in the West for a long time. And that was what guided everyone, even if you were a dissenter, even if you weren't particularly a believer. That was what guided our political class for a long time. It's how institutions were set up. And that was the core message upon which the whole of society was ultimately taught. And then we saw post-World Wars, lots of faith in those institutions collapse, and then these various different ideological revolutions from the 60s, of which we've been talking about some offshoots from, with critical race theory, critical theory in general, which starts to view things in a very different way. And I wonder whether this new governing philosophy of looking at things in the power relations and also dividing people up in a different way to the class-based view that typical Marxians would have looked at it, and now looking at it through ethnic lenses, and now just putting fuel on the fire of something which Christianity, through St. Paul, we are neither Gentile nor Jew, which had ended up in the mindset, is now being expunged from the record from this war on the past. And now we have people who are ultimately bringing us back to this birds of a feather flock together mindset, making it obvious what's different about us all, beginning ethnically, but now obviously there are religious elements to this now too. And I suppose this is an open question. I don't necessarily expect you to have the answer, but the future without the Christian governing ideals, I don't know how long the things like freedom, compassion, equality can remain on the table as something that exists within the culture. The further it gets divorced from that, and the more we keep on juicing our institutions with this other idea of power and victimhood. I don't know what you think about that, Alka.
No, I certainly recognise, what you're describing, and I would agree with the trajectory that you've outlined. It's, and I think religion broadly does have something to do with it, because religion's is the largest, if you like, receptacle for belief, and a society that negates belief is going to be a very dry, shallow, and not a very pleasant place to be in, because as humans, one of the things we do is believe. We think, we believe, and we imagine. Those are kind of fundamental things to being human. On the institutional things, everything I've looked at, I think the one thing I would say is that the collapse didn't happen immediately after the Second World War. I think, if you like, that social democratic period that was materially founded on the establishment of the welfare state was, Marshall, one of the, if you like, the authors of the thinkers of the welfare state, recognized at the time that it would be a compromise. It would be a temporary compromise, but it was a necessary compromise. And it wasn't just a case of providing organizations that could dish out rights or dish out medical services or educational services. It was on such a scale that it did reorganize society. It was provided a framework in which people understood their work lives and built up their work relationships. And it included the Commonwealth, which is how my parents came over to Britain in the early 60s. And so we were a generation of immigrants that had some, if you like, not historical knowledge of British culture in some way, through having been colonized by Britain. And whatever my mum and dad, generations like my mum and dad, thought of Britain politically, they really admired British culture. They admired the high culture, particularly my dad, who was educated. My mum was less educated, but they admired the high culture, Shakespeare and the Romantic poets, but they also admired the possibility, the way of life that British culture offered. The autonomy and respect for the family, the respect for the family, but the autonomy of the family. The idea of an Englishman's home is his castle. The idea that my dad, who in the 70s stood for the local Labour Party, he was amazed. He was saying, in India, this could never happen. I would have to have a sort of bucket full of rupees to be able to bribe my way to be, get anywhere near a political, being a political candidate. So, those kinds of, if you like, less tangible aspects of British life and culture, I think, did provide a commonality, right? They provided a basis for a commonality through which our differences are important. They are what make us unique as well, but they're not the only things. If we set our limits at what makes us different, we're cutting off a huge part of our own selves, really. And that common culture allows, I think, and facilitates the kind of tolerant attitude of a way of life that we associate, that most people of a certain generation associate and admire and love Britain for. And that is going not just through a Marxist march through the institutions, but it's going really because I think, and extrapolating from my research that looked at education and educational policy from the post-war period to, say, the early 2000s, was that they were unable, the ruling classes, if you like, and that includes both parties, not just Labour or Conservative, increasingly felt unable to deliver on that promise, and they began to retreat from it themselves. So you can see, that institutionally there was an actual structural breakup of the whole administrative state under Thatcher in the 80s. Right, that introduced the commercialization element into education that we now see amplified on, turbocharged on testosterone, if you like, in the kind of marketization of, teaching kids about gender, sex, and race. It's not anything that is done by a teacher that is there representing an intellectual and moral leadership. It's being done by paying new so-called experts in race, whatever that may mean, to come in and tell people how rubbish they are if they're white and how victimized they are if they're brown. I mean, this has been, the doors to this have been opened by the institutional and moral retreat of our political class from a project that once was more humane, once was, was able to provide a common culture. It can't do that at the current moment. I don't have an answer. You're right. I don't, but I think we need a new politics. There's got to be a political realignment at some point. That you can't just, do a Blue Peter and say, "Here's what I made earlier." It's kind of going to be a bit more painful than that, I think.